There is a particular kind of ending that history rarely gives us. The kind where no one loses a final battle, no capital is sacked and burned, no conqueror plants a flag and declares the old order finished. Most great empires end dramatically, and we remember those endings because they are clean. They have a before and an after. Rome has its sack in 410 and then its formal deposition in 476. Baghdad has its terrible week in 1258 when the Mongols burn the House of Wisdom and fill the Tigris with ink and blood. Constantinople has its Tuesday in 1453 when the walls that it held for 1,000 years finally fail. These are the endings history gives us most often: catastrophic, dateable, unmistakable. The Gupta Empire of India, the civilization that produced mathematics, we still use in every calculation we make today. Literature that moved Goethe to tears across 15 centuries. Surgical techniques that anticipated modern medicine by a millennium, and a pillar of iron that has stood without rusting in Delhi for 1,600 years, ended very differently. It did not fall. It dissolved. It became, over the course of nearly a century, a name that everyone still used and almost no one quite believed in anymore. This is the story of how India's golden age simply fell apart while no one was fighting. To understand what was lost in this quiet dissolution, you first have to understand what had been built, because the Gupta achievement was so extraordinary that it requires genuine effort to hold in mind. The Gupta Empire began in 320 CE, when a regional king named Chandragupta, no relation to the earlier Chandragupta Maurya who had founded the great Mauryan Empire 6 centuries before, made a politically strategic marriage into the Likavi clan, one of the most powerful families of the Gangetic Plain, and began calling himself Maharajadhiraja, which means King of Kings. It was an act of political theater, as all such title-claiming tends to be, but it was theater built on real military capacity and real administrative ambition. His son Samudragupta transformed that theater into undeniable fact. We know Samudragupta's campaigns in unusual detail for the ancient world because his court poet Harishana carved a meticulous account of them onto the Allahabad Pillar, a sandstone column that had originally been erected by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka some 6 centuries earlier. Samudragupta, in choosing this particular monument for his victories, was making a deliberate and sophisticated statement. He was the heir not just to a regional kingdom, but to the entire tradition of pan-Indian empire, the continuation of what Ashoka had represented. The inscription is one of the most remarkable documents of the ancient world. It describes 9 northern kings violently uprooted and their kingdoms absorbed. It describes 12 southern kings captured in battle and then released as tributaries, a practice the inscription frames in the language of the Vedic Ashvamedha ritual, the horse sacrifice that symbolizes universal kingship. The defeated return to their thrones under Gupta suzerainty, their submission both military and cosmic. Frontier peoples are subjugated. Even the kings of distant lands, the inscription claims, send tribute and seek Gupta alliance. What makes the Allahabad inscription particularly revealing, beyond its catalogue of conquests, is the detail that Samudragupta was also accomplished in music. His coins show him seated and playing the veena, the classical stringed instrument of South Asian musical tradition. He composed poetry. He was, in the language that would be used centuries later by European courts, a Renaissance man, and this is not incidental to the story. The Gupta Empire was not simply a military machine organized for conquest. From its very beginning, it was conceived as a civilization project, the creation of a political and cultural order in which military power, administrative sophistication, religious legitimacy, and artistic patronage would reinforce each other. The warrior king who played the veena was making a statement about what kind of ruler he intended to be and what kind of civilization he intended to preside over. His son Chandragupta II, who ruled from roughly 375 to 415 CE and took the title Vikramaditya, meaning son of valor, brought that project to its highest expression. He conquered the Western Kshatrapas, the Saka dynasty that had ruled Gujarat and Malwa for 2 centuries. And this conquest was transformative in ways that went far beyond territory. The Kshatrapa domains gave the Guptas direct control of the western coast of India and access to the sea trade routes that connected the subcontinent to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the ports of East Africa, and through those ports to the Roman Empire in the west. Silver and gold from this trade poured into the Gupta treasury. The gold coinage of Chandragupta II, which numismatists consider among the finest of the ancient world, reflects this prosperity. Coins of exceptional purity and artistic quality, showing the emperor hunting tigers, performing the Ashvamedha sacrifice, seated in the posture of the divine king, each one a small masterpiece of goldsmithing that simultaneously functioned as commerce and propaganda. It was during this reign, the peak of Gupta power and wealth, that a Chinese Buddhist monk named Faxian made the extraordinary decision to leave China and travel overland to India in search of original Buddhist scriptures. Faxian's journey was remarkable by any standard. He crossed the Taklamakan Desert, climbed through the Hindu Kush passes, and descended onto the Indian subcontinent, arriving in the Gupta Empire around 399 CE. He spent 15 years traveling through India before returning to China by sea. What he found and wrote down when he returned is one of the most valuable documents we possess for understanding the ancient world, because Faxian had no interest in flattering the Gupta emperor. He was a monk interested in monasteries, in the quality of Buddhist scriptural traditions, in the state of the Dharma in the land of the Buddha's birth. Political propaganda was irrelevant to his purposes. And yet his account of the Gupta Empire reads, by the standards of the ancient world, as something approaching utopian. He wrote that people were free to go where they wished without passports or travel documents, something that would have been impossible in most ancient polities. That capital punishment was essentially unused. Criminals were fined for their offenses rather than executed or mutilated, a description of criminal justice that would have seemed extraordinary in any ancient civilization. That the roads were good and safe, that travelers could move without fear of brigands. That in the major cities there were institutions that we would recognize as hospitals, charitable establishments funded by wealthy citizens that treated the sick free of charge. That the people he encountered were generally prosperous, well-fed, and content with their circumstances. Faxian was a precise and skeptical observer. His account is also full of critical commentary on Buddhist practices he found deficient. And this is what his precision found in the Gupta Empire at its height. While Faxian was walking through this prosperous and well-governed landscape, something of even more lasting significance was happening in the courts and academies of the Gupta cities. Kalidasa was writing. The exact dates of Kalidasa's life remain a subject of scholarly debate that shows no signs of resolution and perhaps never will, but the consensus places him in the late 4th or early 5th century CE, almost certainly during the reign of Chandragupta II, likely in the context of the court that later tradition remembers as housing the 9 gems, the great scholars and artists of the Vikramaditya court. Kalidasa's surviving works include 2 epics in Sanskrit, 2 shorter poems, and 3 plays, and they represent the absolute peak of classical Sanskrit literary achievement. Not the beginning of a tradition, not a promising early attempt, but the summit, the point against which all subsequent Sanskrit literature would be measured. His play Abhinanashakuntalam, which tells the story of King Dushyanta who falls in love with the forest girl Shakuntala, forgets her through a curse, and then recovers his memory through the sight of a ring he had given her, is one of the most beautiful works of narrative art ever produced in any language or tradition. When the British scholar William Jones translated it into English in 1789, it became the first Sanskrit literary work that most Europeans had ever encountered, and its reception was immediate and overwhelming. Within years, it had been translated into German, French, Italian, and a dozen other languages. When a German translation reached the poet and playwright Goethe, the man who had already written Faust and Werther and the poems that define German Romanticism, his response was to compose a verse in homage. Wouldst thou the young year's blossoms and the fruits of its decline, and all by which the soul is charmed, enraptured, feasted, fed? Wouldst thou the earth and heaven itself in one sole name combine? I name thee, O Shakuntala, and all at once is said. The greatest poet of the German language encountered the greatest poet of the Sanskrit language across a gap of 15 centuries and recognized a peer. That recognition tells us something important about the quality of what the Gupta civilization produced at its height. Kalidasa was the most celebrated, but he was far from alone. The period produced Varahamihira, whose encyclopedic Brihatsamhita covers everything from astronomy and astrology to architecture, agriculture, gemology, and the interpretation of natural omens, and whose astronomical work in the Panchasiddhantika represents the synthesis of multiple traditions from Greece, Babylon, and India into a rigorous mathematical system. It produced Vishakadatta, whose political drama Mudrarakshasa, about the minister Chanakya and the founding of the Mauryan Empire, remains one of the greatest works of Sanskrit drama. It produced Vatsyayana, author of the Kama Sutra, which is not the narrow sex manual of Western popular imagination, but an encyclopedic philosophical treatment of love, desire, social conduct, and the nature of human pleasure, deeply embedded in a sophisticated epistemological tradition. And in the domain of medicine, the period consolidated and transmitted the traditions of Sushruta and Karaka, whose texts describe medical and surgical knowledge of a sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for 1,000 years. The Sushruta Samhita describes rhinoplasty, the surgical reconstruction of a damaged or amputated nose using skin grafted from the forehead. It describes cataract surgery, performed by inserting a curved needle into the eye and nudging the clouded lens out of the line of sight. It describes detailed anatomical knowledge of the human body, organized by systems in ways that presuppose extensive dissection and observation. The Karaka Samhita approaches internal medicine with what can fairly be called a proto-scientific orientation. Diseases arise from causes. Those causes can be identified and addressed. Treatments can be evaluated by their outcomes. This was a civilization that thought empirically about the natural world, including the human body, at a time when most of the rest of the world was explaining disease primarily through divine intervention or astrological influence. The number system deserves extended attention, because it is perhaps the single most consequential intellectual achievement of the Gupta civilization in terms of its subsequent impact on the world. What we call Arabic numerals today, the 10 digits from 0 through 9, and the positional place value system in which the meaning of a digit depends on its position in the number, were not invented by the Arabs. They were developed in India, in the intellectual tradition that flourished under and around the Gupta Empire, and they were transmitted to the Arab world in the 8th century, from which they passed eventually to Europe, and from Europe to the entire modern world. The Arabs themselves called these numbers Hindu numerals, and were quite clear about their origin. The crucial conceptual breakthrough was the treatment of 0, not merely as an empty placeholder, but as a genuine number with its own arithmetic properties. You can add 0 to something and get the same thing, multiply by 0 and get 0, and eventually the entire edifice of algebra and calculus and modern mathematics becomes possible. This concept did not exist in Roman numerals, which is why Roman numerals are almost completely useless for arithmetic and entirely useless for higher mathematics. It did not exist in Greek mathematics. It existed in the Indian mathematical tradition, and through the Gupta period and the centuries immediately following it, that tradition worked out the full implications of the positional system and 0 in ways that would eventually transform all of human intellectual life. Every bank transaction processed today, every GPS coordinate calculated, every line of computer code executed, every scientific measurement made, every engineering calculation performed anywhere in the modern world uses the number system that Gupta-era mathematicians developed. They built something more permanent than their empire. Aryabhata was born in 476 CE. Pause for a moment on that date. The Western Roman Empire had ended in 476 CE by the conventional dating. Romulus Augustulus was deposed by Odoacer in that same year. But in India, in a civilization whose political structures were already beginning to fragment after the death of Skandagupta 9 years earlier, Aryabhata was being born into a world that would give him the intellectual training to produce, at the age of 23, a text called the Aryabhatiya that stands as one of the greatest scientific documents of the ancient world. In the Aryabhatiya, Aryabhata calculated the value of pi as 3.1416, which is accurate to 4 decimal places. He proposed that the apparent movement of the stars across the sky is not caused by the stars moving, but by the Earth rotating on its own axis, a heliocentric or at least geocentric rotation insight that contradicted the orthodox cosmological view and would not be confirmed in the West until Copernicus and Galileo more than 1,000 years later. He calculated the length of the solar year as 365 days, 6 hours, 12 minutes, and 30 seconds. An error from the modern measured value of approximately 3 minutes and 20 seconds. He calculated the circumference of the Earth as approximately 24,835 miles, a figure remarkably close to the modern measurement of 24,902 miles. And he did all of this in a civilization that was, by the time he was doing his finest work, already politically fragmenting. The feudatories were growing restless. The Huna pressure was intensifying. The succession of the empire was in dispute, and Aryabhata was calculating the circumference of the planet. To understand how the dissolution happened, you have to understand the political architecture that made the Gupta Empire function and the fatal weakness embedded in that architecture. The Gupta system was deliberately, structurally decentralized in a way that the Roman system, for example, was not. The Roman Empire depended on a permanent professional bureaucracy staffed by officials appointed by and answerable to Rome, and on standing armies tied to specific frontier commands and organized under Roman military discipline. These structures were expensive and sometimes corrupt and occasionally rebellious, but they were institutional. They continued to function across changes of emperor because they were tied to the office rather than the person. The Gupta system at its outer edges worked through feudatories, the Samantas, local kings and tribal chiefs who had submitted to Gupta overlordship, acknowledged the emperor's supreme authority, paid tribute at regular intervals, sent troops when the imperial army campaigned, and in return kept their own dynasties on their own thrones, ruling their own territories under their own laws and traditions. This system had enormous advantages. It allowed the Guptas to project a kind of sovereignty across a vast geographical area without maintaining a vast imperial army and bureaucracy at every point. It was cheap. It was flexible. It respected local custom and local authority in ways that reduced the constant friction of occupation. It worked brilliantly as long as the emperor was powerful enough and prestigious enough that the feudatories judged the cost of remaining loyal to be lower than the cost of defecting. The moment that calculation shifted, the moment an emperor was weak enough or distracted enough that a feudatory could stop paying tribute without facing serious military consequences, the logic of the entire structure began to unravel. And when it began to unravel, there was no institutional mechanism to reverse the process, because the loyalty had always been personal and voluntary rather than coerced and structural. The Huna invasions of the mid-5th century applied the first severe external pressure to this system, and the result was instructive. The Hunas, who appear in Western sources as the Hephthalites and are sometimes identified with or related to the broader Hunnic movements that terrorized the Roman Empire in the same period, were a Central Asian nomadic confederation of formidable military capacity. Their pressure on the northwestern frontier of the Gupta Empire intensified through the 440s and 450s CE. When Kumaragupta died in 455 CE, his son Skandagupta inherited an empire already under threat and immediately faced a major Huna incursion. Skandagupta's response was everything that the feudatory system was supposed to produce in a crisis. He mobilized the empire's military resources, conducted a major campaign against the Huna forces, and in inscriptions commemorating his victory described a battle of such ferocity that the earth trembled and his own mother wept tears of joy when she learned he had survived. He repelled them. He drove them back across the frontier. He saved the empire, at that moment, from what might have been a terminal military catastrophe. But the same inscriptions that celebrate this victory also tell us the cost. The treasury had been severely depleted. The silver coinage that Skandagupta issued in the years after his Huna victory has immeasurably lower silver content than the coinage of his predecessors. This is not a textual claim. It is a fact embedded in the physical composition of the coins themselves. A state that issues debased currency is a state under fiscal stress. The Huna victory had been real. Its price had also been real. The Huna problem did not end with Skandagupta's victory, and it was in its second chapter that the structural weakness of the Gupta system became fully apparent. In the decades after Skandagupta's death in 467 CE, as the imperial succession became contested and the center progressively weakened, the Hunas returned. Under their leader Toramana and then under his son Mihirakula, who dominated northwestern India in the first decades of the 6th century, the Huna presence became not merely a military threat but an occupation. Mihirakula controlled much of the Punjab, Kashmir, and neighboring regions. Later Indian and Chinese sources describe him as a persecutor of Buddhism, a destroyer of monasteries, a ruler of unusual cruelty who left widespread destruction in his wake. Whether these accounts represent accurate historical memory or the natural tendency to demonize the most destructive foreign ruler of a generation is a question that cannot be resolved with certainty at this remove. But the archaeological and material evidence does show severe disruption in the northwestern regions during this period. Cities that had been thriving commercial centers contracted or were abandoned. Agricultural patterns were disrupted in ways that take generations to recover from. And most importantly, the western trade routes that had been the economic foundation of Gupta prosperity, the sea and land connections through Gujarat and the northwest that connected India to Persia, the Roman successor states, and East Africa, were severely damaged by the Huna occupation of the territories through which they passed. What happened when Mihirakula was finally driven out of India is the most revealing moment in the entire story of the Gupta dissolution. Around 528 CE, a coalition of Indian rulers assembled to confront Huna power in the subcontinent. This coalition was led by Yasodharman, the king of Malwa, along with other regional rulers. They defeated Mihirakula in a series of engagements that ended Huna dominance in India. This is a genuinely significant military and political achievement. But the Gupta emperor, whoever held that increasingly nominal title in 528 CE, was apparently not a significant participant in this coalition. The inscriptions that celebrate the victory over the Hunas name Yasodharman and the regional kings. They do not name the Gupta emperor as the leader of the resistance. The empire that had repelled the first Huna wave under Skandagupta, the empire that had maintained its feudatory network through crisis and held together under military pressure, could no longer even lead the coalition that defended India from the second wave. The regional rulers had become the real powers. They were fighting for their own territories under their own banners and crediting their own victories to their own dynasties. The Gupta name had become, by 528 CE, an honorific attached to a piece of territory in the east rather than a political fact organizing the subcontinent. The coin evidence traces the trajectory of the dissolution with a precision that texts alone cannot provide. In the reign of Chandragupta II, gold coins of high purity and artistic quality were being minted at multiple locations across a vast territory. The same coinage, the same iconographic conventions, the same weight standards, found from Bengal to Gujarat to the Deccan. This is what monetary unity looks like in the ancient world, and it reflects real political unity. Under Skandagupta, the silver coins debase. The metal content falls, the artistic quality declines, the geographic distribution contracts. After Skandagupta's death, the coin record for the Gupta dynasty becomes fragmentary. Different claimants issue coins in different regions. The geographic reach of each successive emperor's coinage shrinks. Under Buddhagupta, who reigned from roughly 476 to 495 CE, there is still a recognizable Gupta coinage found across a reasonably wide area, suggesting some degree of political coherence. After Buddhagupta, the territory covered by Gupta coinage contracts dramatically and rapidly. The final nominal Gupta emperors, Kumaragupta III, Vishnugupta, and the last claimants of the early 6th century, issued coins found only in fragments of Bengal and Bihar, the eastern fringe of what had been an empire stretching from the Indus to the Bay of Bengal. The mechanism of the feudatory dissolution was quiet and, from the perspective of any individual feudatory, entirely rational. The Vakatakas of the Deccan, the Malharis of the central Gangetic plain, the Maitrakas of Gujarat, the various dynasties that had operated under the Gupta umbrella for generations. None of them sent an army to the Gupta capital to announce that the empire was over. None of them formally declared independence in a ceremony that could be dated and recorded. They simply made a series of incremental decisions, each one individually small and defensible, that in aggregate dissolved the imperial relationship. A feudatory lord stops mentioning the Gupta emperor's name in his inscriptions. Perhaps an oversight, perhaps an assertion of local pride. He starts issuing coins in his own name without Gupta acknowledgement, a small step, but a significant one symbolically. He stops sending the annual tribute, pleading military emergency or bad harvests or any of a dozen other justifiable reasons. He starts using the imperial titles, Maharajadhiraja or its equivalents, that had been reserved for the Gupta emperor himself. Each step is small. The cumulative effect is secession without declaration, independence without rebellion, the end of the empire by 1,000 quiet decisions that individually seemed like administrative adjustments and collectively constituted the dissolution of a political order. Land grants are the other side of this dissolution, the internal mechanism that paralleled the external feudatory drift. The Gupta emperors, like most early medieval South Asian rulers, used the gift of land as a primary tool of political relationship building and religious legitimacy. Granting land to Brahmins built the support of the literate priestly class whose ritual services legitimized kingship. Granting land to Buddhist monasteries maintained royal prestige in the Buddhist world, important for trade relationships and cultural authority across the Silk Road networks. Granting land to military commanders rewarded loyalty and created a hereditary warrior landowner class with an interest in the dynasty's survival. These were politically rational decisions, and the inscriptional record of the Gupta period is full of them. Copperplate grants recording the transfer of specific villages or districts to specific recipients, with detailed descriptions of the boundaries and the immunities attached. The immunities are the problem. Land grants typically came with the right of the recipient to collect revenues that would otherwise flow to the imperial treasury, and with exemptions from the entry of royal officials, meaning the emperor's tax collectors and administrators could not enter the granted territory. Every land grant was thus a permanent reduction in both the fiscal base and the administrative reach of the empire. The Gupta emperors were, through their most characteristic act of political generosity, systematically dismantling the fiscal and administrative infrastructure that made their power real. No single grant was ruinous. The accumulated effect of a century of grants was to create a landscape in which an ever larger share of India's agricultural surplus was flowing to temples, monasteries, and Brahmin establishments rather than to the imperial treasury that needed to pay soldiers and maintain roads and project military power. Here is the deepest irony of the Gupta story, the one that makes it so philosophically rich and so historically instructive. The very abundance of the Golden Age was part of its undoing. The prosperity that allowed Chandragupta II to mint beautiful gold coins and patronize Kalidasa and commission the Iron Pillar also allowed a level of generosity in land grants that a poorer dynasty could not have afforded. The cultural vitality of the period, the building of temples and monasteries, the endowment of centers of learning, the establishment of hospitals, was in significant part funded by the donation of productive agricultural land and the tax revenues from it. The civilization was so prosperous that it could afford to be extraordinarily generous, and that generosity created the institutional landscape, the proliferation of autonomous religious and scholarly establishments with their own immunities and their own economic bases. That made it harder and harder for the imperial center to maintain its fiscal coherence. The Golden Age planted the seeds of the dissolution in the very acts that made it golden. Nalanda University is the clearest and most poignant example of a Gupta institution outlasting the Gupta state by many centuries. Founded in the early 5th century CE under Kumaragupta I's patronage, on the site of a mango grove that tradition associated with the historical Buddha, Nalanda grew over the following centuries into the greatest center of learning the ancient and medieval worlds had produced. At its height, contemporary accounts describe 10,000 students in residence along with 1,500 teachers. The subjects taught ranged from Buddhist philosophy in all its schools to Vedic tradition, from logic and epistemology to grammar and linguistics, from astronomy to medicine to architecture. Students traveled from China, Tibet, Korea, Java, Persia, Central Asia, and every part of the Indian subcontinent, some spending years on the journey before they arrived. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who visited Nalanda in the 7th century CE, roughly 2 centuries after the last Gupta emperor and roughly a century after the Gupta political order had ceased to be meaningful, described an institution of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. 8 great ceremonial halls, 300 lecture rooms, libraries of many floors, towers surrounded by artificial lakes and gardens, an atmosphere of continuous intellectual debate conducted at the highest level of learning available anywhere in the world. Nalanda continued to function as a great university for 600 years after the dissolution of the empire that founded it, until Bakhtiar Khilji's forces sacked and burned it in 1193 CE. The empire was a century of history. The institution it created was 8 centuries of scholarship. The product outlasted the producer by an almost incomprehensible margin. The comparison with the Roman collapse is one that historians have made repeatedly, and the differences are as instructive as the similarities. Both Rome and the Guptas were peak civilizations of the ancient world that declined over roughly the same period in the 5th and 6th century CE. Both faced external pressure from nomadic confederations, the Huns pressing on Roman frontiers and the Hunas pressing on Gupta frontiers simultaneously. Both showed signs of fiscal stress, debased coinage, reduced military capacity, shrinking territorial control. But the endings were different. Rome's Western Empire ended with a datable event. On September 4th, 476 CE, the last Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic military leader who notified the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople that a Western Emperor was no longer necessary. It is a real date with a real event attached, even if historians debate how significant that event actually was relative to the longer process of transformation. The Gupta Empire has no such date. There is no deposition, no formal ending, no moment when someone declared that the thing was over. The last nominal Gupta emperor simply fades from the historical record sometime around 550 CE, still using the titles, still perhaps issuing coins in a corner of eastern India, and then simply not appearing anymore. The empire stopped being because it stopped being believed, and there is no record of the exact moment when the last person stopped believing. What survived the dissolution was, in some ways, everything that mattered most. Indian mathematics traveled west through the Islamic world and transformed European civilization. When Al-Khwarizmi wrote his treatise on algebra in Baghdad in the 9th century, he was working with Indian number concepts transmitted through Persian translations of Sanskrit mathematical texts. When Fibonacci introduced the Hindu-Arabic numeral system to European mathematicians in the 13th century with his Liber Abaci, he was completing a transmission chain that originated in Gupta period India. The zero that Brahmagupta defined in the 7th century, building on foundations laid in the Gupta intellectual tradition, is the conceptual keystone of all digital computing. There are no computers without the binary system of zeros and ones, and there is no binary system without the prior conceptual existence of zero as a number. Every smartphone in every pocket in the world today is, at a fundamental level, a product of Gupta-era Indian mathematics. Kalidasa survived in a different way, but with equal persistence. His works were copied continuously in Sanskrit tradition for 15 centuries before Europeans encountered them, and their encounter transformed European understanding of what ancient literature could be. The Romantic movement's fascination with India's ancient literature, expressed in Goethe's response to Shakuntala and in the broader Sanskrit studies of scholars like William Jones, Friedrich Schlegel, and Max Muller, was in significant part a response to Kalidasa. The comparative mythology and religious studies of the 19th century, which shaped so much of modern humanistic scholarship, was built partly on the Sanskrit literary tradition that the Gupta period had brought to its peak. The Iron Pillar of Delhi still stands in the Qutb Minar complex, surrounded by monuments of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire that came centuries after the Gupta dissolution, still not rusting, still puzzling metallurgists who study its composition, a literal and physical monument to an achievement that outlasted by 16 centuries the political order that commissioned it. The feudatories went their own way. The treasury ran dry. The coins were debased. The succession became contested and then confused and finally irrelevant. The Hunas broke the Western trade routes that had funded the prosperity. The land grants donated away the fiscal base that could have maintained the military. No single catastrophe ended the Gupta Empire because no single catastrophe did end the Gupta Empire. It was ended by a century of quiet adjustments, each one individually rational and defensible, collectively terminal. The center did not hold, not because it was attacked and overwhelmed, but because the centripetal force that had made it a center, the prestige and military power and economic prosperity that made acknowledging the Gupta emperor worth something to the feudatories, slowly, over 4 or 5 generations, faded until there was nothing left to hold to. The last Gupta emperor sat somewhere in eastern India, issuing coins that fewer and fewer people accepted as authoritative, claiming a title that fewer and fewer rulers felt any need to acknowledge until the coins stopped being issued and the claims stopped being made and no one particularly noted the day, because by then everyone had long since organized their political relationships around realities that had nothing to do with the Gupta emperor. The greatest civilization ancient India produced dissolved into the subcontinent it had, briefly, brilliantly unified, leaving behind mathematics and poetry and medicine and architecture and a rust-free pillar of iron that has been standing in Delhi for 1600 years. It fell apart while no one was fighting, and what it left behind outlasted everything that brought it down.